Hello and welcome. I'm Emily Coyote, registered dietitian nutritionist and certified holistic cannabis practitioner and author over at emilycoyotenutrition.com. And today I am sharing my guide with you on ways to use leftover cannabis pulp. I recently received a question over in my Well with Cannabis community from a reader who said, "You've got the best cannabis cookie recipe and the easiest way to infuse coconut oil. Is there anything I can do with that leftover pulp?" And the answer is yes. Don't throw out that pulp. Leftover cannabis pulp, also called sludge, is the cannabis flower material that is left over from making an infusion or a tincture. Now, some folks argue that spent cannabis flower is garbage after the extraction process. Others counter-argue that the leftover weed material is full of beneficial nutrients, compounds, and even a few cannabinoids and terpenes. Chances are there is some good stuff, whether it be CBD or THC, stuck in that leftover plant material, making it worth saving and enjoying for some people. Now, I value all parts of the plant, especially for a full spectrum experience. And anecdotally, many members of my Well with Cannabis community report that they find it beneficial to save the leftover pulp and use it with various effects. So as long as you like the taste and you enjoy it, it's great to reuse and recycle cannabis plant byproducts whenever possible. Now, if you've already made an oil infusion, you can try and reclaim any remaining oil from the leftover pulp using boiling water. To do so, all you need to do is pour boiling water over the leftover pulp and let the butter or oil and water separate and cool. Once cooled, the remaining butter or oil will solidify and rise to the surface. And then you can just remove that remaining solid fat or oil slab and discard the water and the remaining plant material. Now, this process, it does only work for oils that solidify when cold, like coconut oil and butter. It's not going to work for things like olive oil or infused MCT oil. Or you could skip this process and try one of these awesome tried and true ways to use up leftover cannabis pulp. After the infusion and straining process, you will be left with a ball of plant matter left over in your filter, cheesecloth, strainer, whatever you use. Now, if you don't plan to use it in one of these recipes right away, there are a few different ways that you can store it, including refrigerating, freezing, or even drying it out. I do recommend refrigerating or freezing it for oil infusions, and for alcohol extractions, I recommend just drying it out. Just keep in mind what you may want to use it for and store it accordingly. If you plan on using leftover cannabis pulp in a recipe right away, one suggestion is to break down the material before adding it to a dish. This is because sometimes the cannabis flower is not ground before infusing into butter or oil. So that means that the leftover pulp can have a very coarse consistency, which might not be palatable for use in some of these recipes. So to overcome this problem, simply break down that leftover pulp in a blender or a food processor first before adding any of that material to a recipe. This will help ensure no large buds or stems get caught up in the delicious recipe you're about to enjoy. If you plan on using the pulp within a week or so, you can store it right in an airtight container in the fridge. Just remember that if you store it in the refrigerator for longer than a week, you do run the chance of it molding or spoiling because the plant material is present. If you want to store your leftover cannabis pulp for longer than a week, simply store it in the freezer. Freezing does not dilute or destroy any of the remaining potency, and if anything, it helps to retain it. So the leftover pulp, it can be stored in the freezer for a long time, months or even longer. From personal experience, I do recommend storing it in quarter cup or half cup portions, so that way it's easier to pull out from the freezer and use it when you want to. If you freeze it in one big block, you'll have to thaw it all out at once together, and it just can become a mess if you don't want to use it right away. Just remember, when you're thawing, never thaw anything in the microwave, as the microwave can potentially destroy the potency of any remaining cannabinoids. If you've made a cannabis alcohol tincture, it's easy to leave the leftover cannabis pulp out to dry to evaporate off any remaining alcohol. Then you can spread that leftover pulp out on a large surface like a lined baking sheet or pan. Then simply leave it uncovered and allow it to air dry for a few days, stirring frequently. You can feel the material often to see how moist or dry it is. Once it's completely dry, you can store it in an airtight container for future use. Just keep in mind, this method, it does not work for oil infusions because the oil does not evaporate. This is only for alcohol. If you're brand new to edibles or making cannabis recipes, it's important to note that it can be really difficult to estimate the final product potency. And it becomes even more difficult to estimate the potency here because many of the cannabinoids have already been extracted during the infusion or extraction process. Ultimately, the potency of your leftover weed material will depend on many variables. Specifically, two things: the potency of your starting material, the flower, buds, family, or trims, and then the cooking process that you have used. For the recipes featuring cannabis pulp, it is recommended to always start low and go slow still. We recommend starting with just a 1/4 cup of leftover flour or less and putting that in addition to your recipe and going from there. This will give you some time to experiment not only with the potency but the taste too. As the spent cannabis flower, it can have a very strong taste for some people. Now I get to share with you all of my favorite ways to use up the leftover pulp with some general ideas to try and recipes to guide you. Even though it's great to reuse and recycle cannabis plant byproducts whenever possible, the taste and the texture of leftover cannabis pulp might be off-putting for some. This makes filling cannabis capsules with leftover cannabis pulp a perfect solution. Instead of throwing out leftover cannabis flower pulp from making an oil or tincture, many people choose to use it up in a delicious smoothie recipe. For smoothie recipes featuring cannabis pulp, I still recommend starting low and going slow. Start with just a few tablespoons of leftover pulp to your smoothie and going from there. This will give you some time to experiment with not only the potency but the taste too. Everyone knows the best way to wake up is with cannabis in your cup, and to do so, all you have to do is steep the leftover cannabis pulp in a tea ball inside your hot cup of coffee. This coffee option is good for using up the pulp from oil or alcohol extractions. Both options work. Cannabis infused tea. This is the most popular way for many of my Well with Cannabis community members to use up their leftover pulp. The best way to add cannabis pulp leftovers to your tea is to place the leftover plant material in a tea ball and simply steep it in your mug with your favorite tea bag. Cannabis infused golden milk. Golden milk is a creamy, delicious, warm beverage made with anti-inflammatory superfoods like turmeric and cannabis. Traditionally made with infused coconut oil, you can also pack a tea ball full of your leftover cannabis leaves from your oil or butter infusion and steep them directly into this delicious healing beverage. Cannabis brownies. While it's not my favorite way to make pot brownies, you absolutely can add the leftover pulp from making butter to your brownie mix. I do recommend using the infused butter or oil as called for and then adding in that leftover pulp as an additional ingredient. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you found it helpful. If you have any questions at all, please leave them in the comments below. And don't forget, you can get all of your favorite cannabis education, resources, and products over at EmilyKyoNutrition.com.